Was slavery America's original sin? You can find lots of people making that claim. It's even been said by U.S. presidents, first by James Madison and most recently by Joe Biden. It might seem like a fitting metaphor. Slavery was there at the beginning and has corrupted the nation's soul ever since. In this video, however, I want to argue that the comparison of slavery in the United States to the idea of original sin is neither accurate nor helpful. To the contrary, it was a destructive metaphor during the time of slavery and remains such still today. By no means am I minimizing the brutal abjection of American slavery. My objection is rather intended to point out some fundamental problems with the comparison. What's surprising is that to speak of this despicable institution as our original sin actually encouraged American slavery and continues to be a problem for the descendants of slaves still today. First, let's start with a quick review of the doctrine of original sin. It was St. Augustine, that most excellent theologian, who did the most to develop this theological idea back around the year 400. What he called original sin is much more than the first sin. It was the immoral act that led to a corrupting of all human nature subsequent to it. Augustine wrote at length about this inherited condition of humanity whereby guilt and a depraved will are present in every individual at birth. It's important to understand, for Augustine, original sin is part of human nature, not the effect of environmental influences. This sin alienates us from God, and its effect on the will renders human beings incapable of pleasing God. That is, we're all born with something morally wrong with our nature. It's not some foreign element within us, it is us. Augustine, and most Christians who have read the first chapters of Genesis literally, attributed this to Adam and Eve in the garden. But one need not take that story literally to take original sin seriously. Whatever its origin, there's something wrong with us. Original sin is a belief in the essential moral corruption that all human beings share. This doctrine of original sin might then appear to be a fitting description of the place of slavery in the United States. Present from the beginning, this structure of sin has permeated the history of our country like yeast baked into the dough. It was not simply the acts of individual slave owners. As author James Goodwin points out, slavery most certainly was committed day after day, not just by enslavers and traders, but by legislators, lawyers, bankers, investors, and insurers, and all those who benefited from the system and did not struggle to end it. Just as with original sin, we are part of a sinful structure, regardless of our individual acts. The German theologian Dorothee Sölle put it this way: what is meant by Augustine is that we are born into conditions in which we do not cause sin, but already live in sin. Sin is also the destiny into which I was born. I am entangled in it through my parents, my teachers, and my tradition. So, we might understand those who consider slavery not only as the first mortal sin committed by the American people, but the sin that created and embedded a sinful structure that has manifested itself ever since in various expressions of exploitation, injustice, murder, rape, abuse, and violations of all manner of human rights. It might appear that original sin is fitting language with which to discuss America's practice and legacy of slavery, but I strongly contend that it is not. While the comparison rings true in certain ways, I would argue that it turns out to be both bad theology and bad for race relations. Let me suggest 4 reasons why this is so. First, let's consider how slavery was compared to original sin at the time when it was still being practiced. Given that Augustine talked about the cruel necessity of sinning, which comes from our fallen nature, perhaps it shouldn't be too surprising that there were those whose twisted logic led them to claim that the sin of slavery was also necessary. John Patrick Leary has written about this. He describes how Thomas Dew, a philosopher from William and Mary, who in 1831 conceded that slavery was a sin, but an original sin that we could not help but commit. He argued, because ending slavery would bring ruination upon slave owners and slaves alike, emancipation would be an even greater sin. Just like Augustine's original sin, we're stuck with it There's nothing we can do about it, and it's a shame. So why fight it? Take it for what it is, a symptom of a fallen world. Perhaps it was this same reasoning that was in the mind of James Madison, who did believe slavery to be morally wrong and referred to it as America's original sin, but did nothing to curtail it while president and used slave labor himself in the state of Virginia. Like our fallen nature, it's too late now. If it's like original sin, we can't do anything about it. We're stuck with it. There are also some serious theological problems with the original sin comparison. And so related to the first point is our second. Social structures and institutions can be changed. Humanity's innate moral corruption cannot. Augustine believed that all human beings, for all time, or at least until the second coming of Christ, share this debilitating condition. Do we really want to suggest the same of America's institution of slavery? Are its effects permanent? Do things never improve? To be sure, the harmful effects of slavery, of centuries of slavery, remain with us today. But are they forever? Are they fixed, static, and universal, like original sin? Or did the Emancipation Proclamation represent real progress? Were Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, the Civil Rights Acts of 1957, 1960, and 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, were these not advances? In my own 50-plus years, I cannot deny that race relations in America have improved dramatically. The problem with comparing slavery to original sin is that in the latter, things don't change. Humanity doesn't get better. But the history of this country is one where we do see the moral arc of the universe bending toward justice through the efforts of its people. Unfortunately, there are a surprising number of people out there claiming that nothing has changed, nothing has improved. More than just a pessimistic assessment of the reality today, these folks paint a picture of both the present and the future that looks bleak and hopeless. The much celebrated Robin DiAngelo writes that a positive white identity is an impossible goal. White identity is inherently racist. White people do not exist outside the system of white supremacy. If things are so bad, if they will not and cannot get any better, why even try? Why work to improve institutions? Why even make an effort in life if everything is permanently and irrevocably stacked against you? Dr. King held these same concerns in the 50s and 60s. His critique of the Black Power movement was severe. Beneath all the satisfaction of a gratifying slogan, Black Power is a nihilistic philosophy born out of the conviction that the Negro can't win. It is, at bottom, the view that American society is so helplessly corrupt and enmeshed in evil that there is no possibility of salvation from within. King rejected this. Speaking to those who peddled in despair, he continued, "But revolution, though born of despair, cannot long be sustained by despair. This is the ultimate contradiction of the Black Power movement. It claims to be the most revolutionary wing of the social revolution taking place in the United States, yet it rejects the one thing that keeps the fire of revolutions burning, the ever-present flame of hope. When hope dies, a revolution degenerates into an undiscriminating catch-all for evanescent and futile gestures." This is what happens when we communicate that America's racist past can never be shed and transcended. I think King was exactly right. This brings us to the third problem, another theological problem. Original sin has always been the great equalizer. All people, in all times, inherit its morally crippling effects. There are not some with it and some without. However, when we talk about the evil of slavery, that divides people up quite a bit. There were those who committed it, there were those against whom it was committed, and there are those who benefited from its legacy and those who suffered because of its legacy, and of course those who don't fit neatly into either category. Looking at the practice of slavery as original sin doesn't work. Slavery was an actual sin. Some took part. Some were victimized. Some had nothing to do with it. Some opposed it. But with original sin, we are all on the same plane. No one has more or less or none. On the contrary, with slavery, we can't put everyone in the same moral category, nor should we. Lastly, number 4. Talking about a country's original sin, its sinful structures and systems, makes the issue so big and nebulous that it's very easy to do nothing other than virtue signal by speaking the correct words. After many years of hearing people talk about systemic racism, I'm often left thinking, okay, so now what? If racism is just baked into every aspect of our nation and culture, what do I do? If you give me a specific example of injustice or unfairness, I can do something, and I'm likely to want to do so. But talk about systemic racism often leaves me feeling the same as when hippies bemoaned the state of the world and told us, it's society, man. Okay. I'm often told to do the work of identifying examples of my privilege, digging deep into my psyche for unconscious bias, hanging a flag. Those may be fine things to do, but let's be honest. They're not likely to help people who are really struggling in this world. But most of the time, I find myself thinking back to King. Slavery as original sin seems another example of the view that American society is so helplessly corrupt and enmeshed in evil that there is no possibility of salvation from within. At least with the original sin, in Christian theology, there is a solution offered. Believers trust in the canceling of their guilt through faith in Jesus Christ. God then helps them become better people. But that doesn't translate to slavery as original sin. In fact, if you were to talk about forgiveness, a clean slate, and new life with regard to past racial wrongs, you would probably not get an awful lot of support. The sins of slavery, Jim Crow, discriminatory hiring, lynching, nasty behavior, and all the rest are best conceived as actual sins by actual people. We make progress when we deal with actual behaviors, actual conditions, and actual solutions. The nebulous and intangible original sin of slavery, broadly spoken of as systemic racism, seems better suited to navel-gazing than the hard work of improving life for people. If we want to talk about an original sin in America, or really in any of the countless nations and empires around the world that practice slavery, I think what works better would be an original sin of tribalism. Tribalism, you will recall, is the hardwired genetic predisposition that we humans have to denigrate, fear, distrust, and act violently toward people in a different tribe. Tribes can be based on race, culture, nationality, religion, social class, politics, or many other things. Tribalism has often expressed itself as racism and has been behind the enslavement of many people, and remains so still today. Tribalism, as an interpretation of original sin, works a heck of a lot better. First of all, it's universal. It exists within all of us, and so we all must attend to its dangers. Second, it has been part of human existence since the beginning, present even in our pre-human ancestors. Third, you can't get rid of it. It really is baked in. And fourth, it is the impetus for a despairingly large number of brutal sins throughout the history of humanity, ranging from bullying on the playground to genocide. Tribalism as a type of original sin makes more sense theologically. Practically, I think it also makes more sense. We've already discussed various problems in thinking about slavery as original sin, but if all human beings can recognize a common moral corruption within, when we acknowledge our universal penchant for tribalism, we all, as individuals, must constantly be aware of how that may lead to actual sins. It's not simply an obscure historical issue, but an ongoing challenge for all of us. This allows us to remember that yesterday's oppressed may be tomorrow's oppressor, as history makes perfectly clear. All of us are in the same boat. And when we realize we're in the same boat, when we realize we're all basically the same, well, guess what? That's the first step toward overcoming tribalism. There's something to think about. Thank you.